Thank you and welcome to this information session on crystalline silica substances in mining and construction. So my name is Katie Geszner. I'm an Education and Engagement Advisor and I'll be hosting today's webinar. In this session, we will dissect the regulations on crystalline silica substances, outlining the requirements for businesses and providing guidance on how to stay compliant. Before we get started, I would just like to take the time to respectfully acknowledge the Geszner people as the traditional custodians of the lands which we meet on today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening to this session. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their ongoing connections and cultures to the land and waters of South Australia. We'll meet our other presenters in a moment, but first just a little context on why we're talking about crystalline silica substances. So on the 1st of September last year, 2024, new regulations outlining additional obligations for PCBUs working with crystalline silica substances were introduced, following on from the ban on engineered stone that was in force on the 1st of July, 2024. And since these regulations have come into effect, SafeWork SA has received many queries about these regulations and what they mean for different businesses and industries. We're also seeing a large number of workplace exposure exceedances and complaints related to silica exposure as well. In our construction industry priority harms campaign, the biggest compliance campaign ever undertaken by SafeWork SA, which was launched on the 1st of July this year, 2025. Crystalline silica substances is one of the 10 key focus areas. And so this means that inspectors will be conducting site visits and auditing workplaces to ensure they are managing the risk of silica dust exposure appropriately as per the regulations. And then in addition to that, our mining team has also launched a compliance campaign, which you'll hear a bit more about today, targeting the industry's compliance with these new regulations. So today, we will dissect these regulations and unpack what you must do to adhere to these. We hope that by the end of today, you have a strong knowledge and understanding of the crystalline silica regulations so you can protect your workers from harmful dust exposure and stay compliant. Now, let me introduce our presenters for today. So we have Stuart Robb, who's the manager of the construction team at SafeWork SA. Welcome, Stuart. Thank you for being here. We also have Michael Paterson, who's the team leader of the mining team. So welcome, Michael. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Katie.
And finally, we have Ryan Jurkowski, who's the occupational hygienist from SafeWork SA's work environment team. So Ryan will be answering some technical questions and also will be sticking around to answer any questions at the end of the webinar as well. So welcome, Ryan. Thank you for being here.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie.
So here's a quick overview of what will be covered in today's session. So we'll begin by outlining the regulations that came into effect in September 2024. We'll discuss how to identify and control CSS, as well as the requirements for businesses working with high-risk silica. Then Ryan is going to provide some specialised advice on training and air monitoring. Then Stuart and Michael will discuss the construction and mining campaigns respectively and just talk about what their teams will be looking for to stay compliant. And then finally, at the end, we'll have a Q&A session where we will endeavour to answer some of your questions. So if you do have any questions throughout the webinar that you'd like answered at the end, do put them into the Q&A tab at the top of the screen, fill them in there, and we'll answer as many questions as we can at the end. Also, just before we start as well, this session will be recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So there will be that recording available, but we will not be sharing the slides. So there will be a recording available, but the slides will not be shared. Okay, let's get started now. So looking at the regulations themselves, What do they actually include? So the regulations provide definitions for processing. So what is processing? It provides a definition for what a crystalline silica substance is. What is crystalline silica and what is engineered stone? So it provides definitions for all those things. It also outlines the control measures that must be used when working with crystalline silica substances and the requirements for working with high risk CSS or crystalline silica substances. So today we're going to break down the regulations into 3 steps. And so we're going to have a look at the first one now, which is, are you processing a crystalline silica substance? This is the first question you need to be asking yourself. Okay, so let's have a look at what the regulations define as a CSS, as a crystalline silica substance. So it's a material containing at least 1% crystalline silica by weight. And so if we look at the list of materials here, we can see that different materials have widely different amounts of silica in them. So the more silica content, the more strict we need to be when managing the risk of exposure. Okay, so if we're working with sand and sandstone, which has between 70 and 100% percentage of silica, we need to be a lot more diligent in our controls and a lot stronger in our controls than if we're working with, say, limestone and marble, which only has 2% of silica. If you are working with any of these kind of materials, then you are working with a CSS. You are working with a crystalline silica substance. Okay, so if we figured out where we are using a CSS, okay, now we need to figure out, are we actually processing a CSS? So what is processing? So the use of power tools or mechanical plant to carry out an activity involving crushing, cutting, grinding, trimming, sanding, abrasive polishing, or drilling of a CSS. So if you're doing any of those things with power tools, processing. If you're using road headers to excavate CSS material, if you're quarrying, mechanical screening, or tunneling through a CSS material, and then if you're undertaking any other process that may expose you to respirable crystalline silica during the manufacture or handling of a CSS. So that's things like if we're sweeping up dust, if we're vacuuming dust, if we're working in any kind of, or doing any kind of task that might expose us to that respirable silica. Okay. So if we are doing one of these tasks and we're doing it with a crystalline silica substance, then we are processing a CSS. And so we need to move on to step number 2, which is the processing of the CSS high risk? So what do I mean by high risk here? So the regulations define high risk processing as processing of a CSS that is reasonably likely to result in a risk to the health of a person at a workplace. Okay. Another way of looking at it is basically when the airborne concentration of silica is reasonably likely to exceed half of the workplace exposure standard for silica, or the WES. Okay. So if it's going to be higher than 0.025 milligrams per meters cubed over an 8-hour stage. Okay. So this means basically that the most effective way to determine whether your work is high risk is by undertaking air monitoring. It is just really important to note, and you'll see it's there in the red box there, that if you can't determine if processing is high risk, then you must assume that it's high risk. So if you can't do air monitoring, if you're unsure, you need to still assume it's high risk unless proven otherwise. So besides air monitoring results, there are some other things that we can take into consideration when assessing whether processing is high risk or not. So first of all, what is the estimated percentage of silica in the CSS? So as we said before, if it's more than 1%, then it is a CSS. But the higher the amount of silica in the material, the more likely it will be high risk, and the more likely it's going to exceed that WES number. Are there any previous relevant air or health monitoring results available? So can these results inform your decision? So you may not have to redo air monitoring if you do have recent results from a similar workplace doing a similar task. Ryan is going to talk a bit more on this later and what that all means. So I'll leave that to him to explain later. Have there been any previous incidents, illnesses, or diseases associated with RCS exposure at the workplace? Okay. So if so, it may be likely again if the same task has been completed with the same materials, etc. And then what is the specific processing that will be undertaken and the frequency and duration of each task? So depending on the duration of the processing, it may not be high risk. So for example, if the task is only being done for say 15 minutes, it may not be high risk. Okay. So SafeWork New South Wales actually listed some examples of tasks that may or may not be high risk or may not exceed half the WES based on the type of task and the duration of the task. Okay. And so this is just a guide, all right? As it says, it's likely or unlikely. So it doesn't mean that 100% it's not going to exceed the WES, but it's likely that it won't. So what's likely to exceed half the WES? So things like grinding concrete, cutting concrete or bricks, jackhammering concrete or sandstone, etc. And then what is unlikely to exceed half the WES? So using non-powered tools to score, snap or slip tiles or bricks, mixing dry materials for less than 15 minutes per day. So we've got that time factor in there. If we're hand sanding or finishing, and if we're working with silica containing products while wet. So those tasks are unlikely to exceed half the WES. That doesn't mean that you should assume, yep, they're not, this is not a high risk task. We still need to make sure that we're checking, that we're doing our risk assessment, etc. But this can give you a bit of an idea as to some tasks that may not exceed the WES. Okay, so we've assessed whether or not our processing of CSS is high risk. Okay, now we need to go to step 3, which is controlling the processing of CSS. Okay. So whether your processing is high risk or not, okay, it must be controlled. So you shouldn't be carrying out, or you must not carry out any processing unless it's controlled. And so to control the risk, we need to use one of the following control measures listed there on the screen. So the isolation of a person from dust exposure, a fully enclosed operator cabin fitted with a high efficiency air filtration system, an effective wet dust suppression method, on-tool extraction, and local exhaust ventilation. So we need to be using at least one of those control measures. If you are using a vacuum system or a ventilation system, just make sure that you're tailoring the type and class of the vacuum to the type of job you're doing and the amount of silica being produced. So this means choosing between an M class or a H class vacuum, depending on the materials, task, and the duration. Okay, so remember to consider that percentage of silica in the substance you're working with. So as I've said a couple times already, the more silica in the substance, the more controls you should use, the stronger and more stringent the control should be. Right, so you'd want to be using more stringent controls when working with sand or granite, materials that have a higher percentage of silica than if you're working with, say, marble, which only has a small percentage. So if after using one or more of those controls, as shown on the previous slide, your workers are still at risk of being exposed to the CSS, then you must provide them with the correct respiratory protective equipment, so the correct RPE, and make sure that it's worn while the work is being completed. And so as with the other controls, make sure that you're choosing your RPE based on the concentration of dust that will be produced as well as, again, the silica content of the materials used. Okay. It should also comply with the Australian standards on the screen there. So you've got 17, 16, 2012 respiratory protective devices, and 17, 15, 2009, which is the selection, use and maintenance of respiratory protective equipment. So make sure that your RPE is complying with those. And if you'd like access to those Australian standards, they are available to access for free through our library service, which I'm going to talk a bit more about at the end. Okay, so those are the controls and things that we should be using for all kinds of silica processing. If we're processing high risk CSS, or we're completing high risk processing, there are a few additional requirements. Okay, so we need to be developing a silica risk control plan. We need to provide instruction, information and training for workers. We need to undertake air monitoring, and we need to provide health monitoring. So let's go into a bit more detail about those. So your silica risk control plan. So this plan must include identification of all the work activities that are high risk. So what are the activities that you're doing that are high risk? It should have a copy of the risk assessment that determine the work as high risk. So how did you determine that it's high risk? You know, think about those questions that I went through before. Maybe you've got your air monitoring results in there, etc. And then it should document the control measures that will be used to control the risk and how these will be implemented, monitored and reviewed. So the content that should be in there is quite similar to what should be in a SWMS or a SafeWork method statement. So if you're familiar with those and have written those before, the silica risk control plan is fairly similar in terms of the content that needs to be in there. Okay. Also, just need to make sure that it's accessible, it's easy to understand, that all the workers have access to that plan and they understand what's written in there, and that it's developed in consultation with workers and with any HSRs as well, if there are any. Once that control plan is in place, we must follow the control plan, or work should cease immediately. So if there is a change of plans, if you know, you need to change the way you're doing things, then you should stop work, change your control plan, and then restart the work. Okay. So this is an example of a silica risk control plan. This is a template which can be found in SafeWork Australia's Working with Crystalline Silica Substances guide, which you can see here on the screen. So you can see that this template it has space for PCBU information. It has a section for risk assessment, a section for control measures, and it also allows you to record worker training, which is actually the next requirement for high risk processing of CSS. So is a good way to just make sure you're tracking that as well and recording that training, kind of killing two birds with one stone. So training. So a PCBU, they must provide crystalline silica training to any worker they reasonably believe will be involved in the processing of CSS, so they're actually doing the job, or if they're at risk of exposure to silica dust due to the processing. So if they're going to be in the work site, or on the work site when the processing is happening. Okay, and this training needs to address the health risks associated with exposure to silica, and also the need for and proper use of control measures. Okay, so this training is really important. You must also ensure that there's a record of this training, which is kept for 5 years after the worker ceases working for the PCBU. So even after that, the particular worker has left your workplace or has moved on to another job in another company, you still need to keep those records for 5 years. And so, you know, you can use a silica control plan to record the training and keep those training records. Now, I'm going to call on Ryan now. So the regs do state that this training must be nationally accredited. So can you just provide some advice on what this means for businesses?
Yeah, for sure. So as you were mentioning just a little bit before, the regulations, specifically Regulation 529 CD, mentions that crystalline silica substance training means training that is accredited or training approved by the regulator. So we've got two options here. So for the first one, for accredited training, there is a course that is recognised as accredited training in South Australia, and this is the 10830 NAT course, and it's a course in crystalline silica exposure prevention. So I believe there's one or two registered training organisations in South Australia that deliver this module. And essentially this covers what Katie was mentioning before in terms of the health risks associated with RCS, the need for proper use of any risk control measures required by regulations, and as an evidentiary evidence sort of thing that we'll be looking for as regulators is we'll look for records of training such as certificates just to meet compliance. On the other hand, if accredited training is not suitable for your company, SafeWork South Australia, apologies, are now accepting applications from specific parties to have their own training packages considered as regulator-approved training. This training must meet the course criteria as seen to the right of the screen here, and there's a QR code there if you want to scan that and have a look at the criteria. This training that's regulator approved must be 3 hours in duration, must be delivered by a competent person, such as an occupational hygienist or someone with relevant experience. To support your application, you must attach a copy of your course content and training plan. So we will then review the application, and if it's approved, we'll store this in our database, and I believe we'll publish it on our website. This will mean that the training from this specific company has been approved, meeting compliance requirements. And yeah, this is just a good opportunity to conduct training that is specific to your industry, company, or tasks performed.
Oh, thank you for that, Ryan. And you can see there that course criteria, sorry, document is available on our website, and there is a QR code there on the screen if you're interested in having a look at that. So the final additional requirements for high-risk process work are air monitoring and health monitoring. Okay? So businesses should be providing health monitoring and conducting personal air monitoring for all workers who are carrying out the processing of high-risk silica, CSS. So with the health monitoring, okay, this can take the form of lung capacity tests. It can be a chest X-ray or CT scan, and a medical questionnaire, among others. So there's a few different other options there as well. And it must be done by a registered medical practitioner with experience in health monitoring in this particular area. So shouldn't just be sending our workers to their GP. We need to make sure that it's going to somebody that is an expert in the field that's done it before. Now, if we talk about air monitoring, I'm going to move again to Ryan. Can you just elaborate on air monitoring a bit for the audience and give a bit more insight as to exactly what inspectors will be looking for here?
Yeah, for sure. So first off, you've done a good job with the health monitoring requirements, but with air monitoring, so as you mentioned, Katie, we'll be looking for a personal monitoring. This is because personal air monitoring is an indication of personal exposure and therefore is in compliance with the workplace exposure standard. Static monitoring can also be conducted, and although it's useful to determine hotspots of respirable crystalline silica, it will not be compliant with the workplace exposure standard, as static monitoring does not indicate personal exposure. So looking for personal monitoring there. So as such, air monitoring must be conducted for high-risk CSS processes or if uncertainty exists. If air monitoring has not been conducted at your workplace previously to determine high-risk silica work, you could use similar exposure groups, which essentially are groups of workers who are expected to have similar exposure to hazards. In this case, that would be respirable crystalline silica. You can use previous air monitoring data from other sources, such as the manufacturer of the control or the tool that's being used, an industry association, or you could engage your own occupational hygienist to get an personal air monitoring survey done for you. So please note that the PCBU should ensure that air monitoring results from other sources are relevant to the tasks performed, controls, and the conditions of the workplace. And they should consider things like the frequency and the duration of the tasks performed, the material and the processes used, the work procedures, the source of exposure, the work environment, just to ensure that those similar exposure groups for air monitoring are consistent with the tasks that you will be doing it in. If not, then the data may not give an inaccurate indication of the airborne concentration of RCS and whether the processing is high risk. However, as Katie mentioned before, as per Reg 529 CA, there are other factors to consider when determining if a CSS process is high risk. Cool. So yeah, if an exceedance of the respirable crystalline silica workplace exposure standard, that is 0.05 milligrams per meters cubed, if that has occurred, the PCBU is required to notify SafeWork Australia within 14 days after the PCBU receives the results. This can be done by the online form as depicted on the screen, and this will take you to the notification portal where there will be prompts just to give details of the exceedance. So if you scan the QR code there, that will take you directly to that.
Well, thank you for that, Ryan. So to help you ensure that you are meeting compliance with all those things, we are currently in the process of creating a self-assessment tool for crystalline silica substances. So this document has questions similar to the questions on the audit tool inspectors will be using. Oh. Sorry about that, everybody. I don't know what's happening there. So yes, we have this self-assessment tool, which is coming soon. So this document will have questions similar to the questions on the audit tool the inspectors will be using when conducting their site visits as part of the construction campaign. So just watch this space for when this will be released. We will be posting about it on our social media pages and also sending through a copy of this tool to everyone who attended today's webinar or who was signed up for the webinar once it's finalised. So just another tool for you to use to help you make sure you're compliant. Okay, so I've talked about, or Ryan and I have talked about all the things. So let's summarise it. So the first thing we need to be asking ourselves is, are we actually processing a CSS? Okay, if we are, if yes, then we need to assess whether the processing is high risk or not. Okay, and so we do that by conducting air monitoring, by considering the percentage of silica in the substance, by considering how long, the duration of the task, among other things. Okay, if the work is not high risk, okay, then we need to make sure that we are using one of these 5 control measures. So isolation, a fully enclosed operator cabin, wet dust suppression, on-tool extraction, or local exhaust ventilation. So we need to be using one of those 5, and also, if needed, RPE as well. If the work is high risk, then we still need to be using those controls, but we need to implement the additional requirements. So having our silica risk control plan, providing our training to the workers that are involved in the processing or maybe at risk of exposure, undertaking air monitoring, and providing health monitoring as well. This flowchart will also be available as a resource as well in the future. So we'll make sure to send that one out to all of you as well. Okay. So we're now going to hear from Stuart, who's going to give some guidance on the regulations, specifically from a demolition and construction perspective. So hand it over to you, Stuart.
Thank you, Katie, and morning to all out there. So basically, I've got a couple of slides to present on, and the intent of my presentation is to try and clear up potential confusion out there amongst industry. So I've got two focus areas, asbestos removal and how it applies to the silica regulations, and demolition activities. So to confirm, for asbestos removalists, you basically are captured in the silica regulations. So you are locked into identifying the processing of a silica substance that is high risk. So for your average work in removing asbestos cladding, eaves, deep six roof, deep six fence, that product is basically cement sheeting that is likely to contain over 1% silica. So therefore you get forced to comply with the identification and assessment process under the regulations for silica. Under the context of your controls in managing the asbestos removal process, your average removal works for asbestos material will be low risk. The reason it's low risk because you're not grinding it, you're not breaking it up, should not be breaking it up, etc., etc. You're managing it in a way, or removing it in a way, that's not likely to create a dust or a fibre release. So you have to do the assessment process to comply with this regulation, because it is a silica product, or a product that contains a high level of silica, so it needs to be dealt with. On saying that, there are occasions, and removalists will have to think this through. I have seen situations where people have had to remove silica containing floor tiles. They've had to jackhammer smash through those tiles to get to asbestos material that's been covered over by tiles, etc., etc. In those situations, you may be looking at what could be determined as a high-risk silica activity. So that has to be taken into consideration when you're dealing with your scope of works to get your asbestos material removed from the work area. There are templates. I cannot advise enough to industry out there. There are templates available on the SafeWork Australia website. I am strongly suggesting you copy and paste the information from those templates, put them into your own document templates, and that will ensure that you are not missing critical steps under the regulations to meet the criteria for doing the assessment process correctly. What I'm finding to date is a lot of people will simply do a risk assessment based on a SWMS approach, and that's not meeting the criteria in the tent or the subject matter that you need to tick off under your assessment process. So once again, strongly recommend industry goes to the guide, copy and paste the content, stick it into your own document, and that way it'll set you up for success. Silica control plans. Again, cannot recommend strongly enough. Use the content under the guide, put that into your own document. It will help set you up for success to make compliance with the very individual items under the regulations. Just to confirm with industry out there, for asbestos removal or demolition, your compliance with your own silica control plan. If you document you will do A, B, and C, when an inspector attends site, they will review that plan and they will expect to see you implementing A, B, and C. If you are not implementing A, B, and C, under the regulations, you must stop immediately, and you can only resume the activity again when you're complying with that control plan. We are seeing a bit of industry just documenting items in there in their control plan, but when we attend site, none of that's actually been actioned. Duty to control train workers. We've covered that subject enough, I believe, in detail, but I want to highlight for those that have done silica training in their past in larger type organisations, that internal training is handy, it's good, but it doesn't meet the intent and the regulatory requirements. So you need to go out there and do the correct training now. Monitoring in relation to processing of CSS that's high risk. I'm finding from the asbestos removal domain, people believe that medical alone will also cover off requirements for silica health monitoring. I'm suggesting that doesn't. I can't guarantee that it doesn't, because you've never actually sat down and as an employee and discussed the situation with a doctor that's reviewing you for silica health monitoring. Normally you've only spoken about asbestos removal. We've not made a doctor aware. Other elements of the criteria for that health monitoring, i.e. an X-ray, is missed or not conducted. So if you're relying purely and solely on silica health to meet the intent of health monitoring for silica, that may not be the case. Need you to go back and revisit that, make sure it's compliant. Next slide is to do with demolition and engineered stone guidance. There's some confusion out there with the demolition domain. So to make it crystal clear to industry out there doing demolitions, your average house demo these days may contain engineered stone bench tops. People do renovations. It might be a 1950s, 1960s home, but people do renovations. Kitchens, bathrooms often get renovated, and this is where engineered stone bench tops can get introduced into a demolition activity. So under the regulations, you cannot process that engineered bench top. So in the context of taking to it with an excavator, pulverising it, smashing it up, loading it in the back of a truck, throwing it away at the local tip, that in theory is a processing activity, and under the regulations you can't do it. However, there are exemptions put into the benchtop regulations or the engineered stone regulations that allows you to remove it. So in the context of the exemption, you can remove the stone material for the purpose of removing it to do the disposal. So prior to you swinging away with the excavator, it would require workers trained, etc., to go in there, all your assessments done, to go in there, remove the stone bench tops, not hit them with hammers, smash them up, remove them and maintain intact pieces, but you can remove them for the purpose of disposal. And to clarify for industry that are doing that out there for demolition, where you may inadvertently interact with engineered bench tops, you need to notify the regulator of any removal disposal activities. So you have two ways to go about this. You can forecast that you may do 20 jobs in a year. You can notify the regulator that you may do 20 of those jobs in the year. Alternatively, you can notify the regulator that you've had to deal with engineered stone after the fact. So you can notify the regulator in two ways, in advance and basically after the fact as soon as possible. And thank you very much to all. That's about me covered off on that. I'll return back to you, Katie.
Thank you very much for that, Stuart, and we'll have you stick around to the end in case there are any questions. I dare say there may be. All right. I'm now going to move to Michael, who's going to talk about the impact on the mining sector and give some advice, for the mining industry on this topic.
Thanks, Katie. With regard to the mining operations, I'd like to take a quick look at how the regulations under Chapter 8A for crystalline silica substances overlap with Chapter 10 for mining. There are a few ways in which the silica regulations can interact or overlay with the obligations for mine operators. As it's well known in the mining and quarrying industry, almost all materials that are mined and quarried in South Australia contain greater than 1% silica. That includes limestone. A documented assessment must be undertaken to determine if your processing is high risk, and that record must be kept in your mine record. This may be your risk assessment as required under Regulation 617, but only if it also meets the requirements of Regulation 529CA. Under Regulation 612, any high-risk CSS processing is essentially going to be a principal mining hazard, as it could, over the course of time, present the risk of multiple deaths from the workplace. The CSS assessment may also be used to meet your duties under Regulation 627 if it meets those requirements. And the silica risk control plan must be integrated into your safety management system, and maybe also your principal hazard management plan under 628 if it meets all of those above requirements. When inspectors are attending site, we will be seeking documentary evidence and information that shows that these requirements are being met when undertaking inquiries on site. Over the course of the coming financial year, SafeWork SA mining inspectors will be undertaking Crystalline Silica substance compliance campaign, which will incorporate audits on mines and quarries across the state. There will be information available on the SafeWork SafeWork SA website. A self-audit tool is in production, and that will facilitate both mines and quarries in being able to meet your obligations ahead of inspectors coming for audits.
I'll just quickly jump in there, Michael, just quickly.
Yep.
So this is a different self-assessment tool to the one that I showed earlier. So the one that I showed earlier is for the construction campaign. So there will be a separate one which will be for the mining campaign. So, yeah.
Yeah, beg your pardon there, Katie. So the self-check tool for mines and quarries will be that overlay between the Chapter 8A obligations and the Chapter 10 obligations. We will be auditing both mines and quarries, so yeah, stay tuned over the next financial year. Looking at controls, there are several established controls in mining to manage dust, although it's acknowledged that historically it has been difficult to effectively manage controls. However, effective controls must be implemented so far as is reasonably practicable. There's a list here on screen that goes a long way to meeting your obligations, things like good housekeeping, not having large quantities of dust built up around your site, water sprayers, bulk curtains, water carts, dust suppressants, pressurized and filtered operator cabins, personal dust extraction booths. For those who haven't seen these devices, they're a chamber in which a worker with contaminated clothing can enter, and then the person still wearing their PPE will go through a cleaning process to help mitigate that risk that comes from doffing that equipment. You may also look at enclosing a processing plant and having mechanical extraction to prevent that dust reaching the atmosphere in the first place. Underground ventilation design and control can greatly affect your silica concentration in the atmosphere and should be considered. You may also consider, particularly for quarrying operations, moving your operations out of the prevailing winds. So you may not want to put your crush and screen operation on top of a hill. And of course, in adverse weather conditions and where the dust is not able to be controlled, you really need to have a look at operational stand down for adverse conditions. As mentioned earlier, Regulation 529B requires that respiratory protective equipment is provided and used where the CSS exposure risk exists. Now, these standards are called up in law and therefore are entirely enforceable. One of the details that is noteworthy in that is that this will require the implementation of a respiratory protection program administered by an appointed and suitably competent program administrator. There will be an expectation that this is reported in the mandatory safety management system. So that'll be covering all of the provisions and what competencies you require for that program coordinator. Now, there's additional information and advice available to industry. Particularly our friends in the quarrying industry may find the Mining and Quarrying Occupational Health and Safety Committee, or QOSH, quite useful. They have a significant amount of information on their website, and there is some free to industry assistance available for small and medium operations. You may also consider speaking with industry bodies such as the South Australian Chamber of Mines and Energy, or you may engage your own subject matter experts such as occupational hygienists. Of course, always consult your workers. You may also wish to speak to any relevant unions, as well as equipment suppliers and OEM.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Michael. There's some good advice in there, so thank you for that.
No problem.
Before we move to our Q&A, I just want to share some free services that SafeWork SA has available to support you and your workers. So firstly, we do have a free library service, which I mentioned earlier. So that's available to anyone working or living in South Australia. As part of our library service, we have a wide variety of resources, so videos, posters, books, and the big one is all the Australian standards as referenced in the legislation. So usually those Australian standards can be anywhere from $150 to $200 to get access to, but you can get access to them for free through our library service. So you sign up online, you request what you want to borrow, and then it gets posted out to you, and then you just send it back. So you don't even have to leave the comfort of your couch or your office. So if you are interested in that, there's a QR code there on the screen, which will take you to that. We also have a free advisory service, which provides information and support to small and medium-sized businesses. So our advisors can visit your workplace for up to 2 hours at a time to help you understand your WHS responsibilities, and also offer some practical support and advice to improve your specific systems, practices, and approach to safety. We can also come and present an information session on a wide variety of different topics as well, to workers, your management teams, whatever. So if you're interested in utilising that resource, again, it's 100% completely free. There is a QR code there on the screen, or you can give us a call there on our number. Okay, I'm now going to move to the Q&A section. So if you haven't already, just make sure you pop your questions into that Q&A tab. So we do have a few questions. Okay. Yeah, we actually have quite a few questions. So question here, which is potentially for Ryan, but Michael and Stuart, feel free to pop in at any time. Is there a minimum frequency for health monitoring and for dust monitoring to meet the regulation? So this person says, what is the definition of recent monitoring results?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dylan. So the regulations don't specifically mention regular intervals for that. However, I think I believe Shelley's provided a good resource to you in response to that one. It's the health monitoring. I believe it's the guidance document. And so what that sort of mentions is we sort of leave how regular health monitoring is conducted to be governed a little bit by the physician, but it's really recommended to get a baseline spirometry done when the worker starts work. And that spirometry is just sort of like a lung function test. It should be done yearly. And also recommending, well, PCDs should get a baseline X-ray or CT scan done. And because you don't really want to pump workers full of radiation, it's sort of recommended that to be done every 5 years or within the first 20 years of workers working there. So nothing exactly prescribed by the regulations, how it helps to have a baseline spirometry and X-ray done. Similar for personal dust monitoring, regulations don't specifically mention exactly when any sort of prescribed timeline for dust monitoring. But it is good practice when, to do some monitoring if your conditions change. So if you're using a different substance, if you're doing a different work process or something like that, air monitoring would be warranted just to ensure that those controls and conditions are adequate enough to control against the dust produced. But, it's also good practice just to have a regular schedule in place just to ensure that, monitoring is done on a somewhat regular basis just to validate controls.
Thank you, Ryan. Our next question, and this one, I guess, is sort of for all of you, but maybe more so for Stuart and Michael. Can a safety management system used by Tier 1 contractors constitute a silica risk control plan if it can be shown to meet all criteria for a silica risk control plan? This has been an accepted approach in New South Wales, Queensland and WA after discussions with those regulators.
In essence, the guide or my suggested approach to it was to take the contents of the guidance provided on SafeWork Australia's website and use that as a template to form within your own systems. If you wish to do something else, you may do so. The regulations don't spell it out or stipulate how it needs to look. So if you wish to use another level of system or approach to it, that's fine as long as it meets the criteria and the intent. And the way I look at it, if I can go through the regs and it says you need to do A, if I can go across to your document and see that A is included in your control plan, point B, point C, etc., you're technically compliant with the intent of the regulations. So yes, you can use alternative safety management systems. Bear in mind there is an intent that they're supposed to be available and used by workers at site level. So if you've got something that sits in a system and never sees a light of day by workers, you're probably missing the intent of the regulations. I personally, and this isn't the regulator speaking, I'd like to see dirty, curled up control plan on a site, signatures of workers, and they're actually read it, understand it, and complying with it. That's truly the intent of the regulations of managing that work process.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stuart. Just on that as well, there was a question, was kind of connected to that, about a clause in the regulations about high-risk construction work, allowing you to include CSS controls within your SWMS, in your existing SWMS, instead of having a standalone control plan.
Yes, under the regulations, you can do that. Based on what I've seen to date out there in industry and our audits, your SWMS document must be equal to or better than the control plan. Everything to date I've seen is far from that. So yes, you can do it. We'll hold you to the intent of the regulations that the document, the SWMS document must be equal to or better than the control plan requirements. If you can achieve that, great, you're complied with the regulations. If you're missing the intent of the control plan, you're not compliant and will take compliance action based on those findings. But yes,
Thanks.
the regulations do allow you to use a SWIMS process.
Thank you, Stuart. We've got a few questions here about talking about RPE. So it says regarding the need for respiratory protection, does this force the requirement for a PPE fit testing regime? And what is the minimum required frequency of fit testing?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. It's written in the regulations. I'm just trying to find the exact regulation. I believe it's under the work environment, but sorry, I'll try and get that regulation up for you. So without that, there is a regulation. I can follow up with you afterwards as to what that might be, but it's under the general working environment. And it states that for all sort of work, if workers are required to wear PPE, then that PPE must be a suitable size and fit and comfortable to wear for the worker who is to wear and use it. And the best way to ensure that it is a suitable size and fit is to get fit tested. And so that fit testing just ensures that, whatever mask people are wearing is adequate enough to protect against any sort of airborne contaminants there. In terms of frequency, the standards that I believe Katie referenced in previous slides, I think that's AS 1715, I believe, and also referenced in the regulations. They recommend that fit testing is conducted yearly, or if there's a change in a person's facial characteristics, so if someone loses a lot of weight or if they lose teeth and it sort of affects how their face sort of sits, if there's change in those, fit testing, and if not, then it's recommended annually.
Yeah, and as Ryan was saying there, just stressing that those two Australian standards, having been called up in legislation, are now enforceable. It would very much behoove you all to ensure that you understand what's in those documents and be sure that anywhere where they're saying that you must, you must.
Thank you. So I'm going to get a couple questions here about training and about how do we know, so is there a definition criteria for the competent person to deliver a business's own regulator approved training? And also some questions about, I guess, who can apply to have regulator approved training, to get their training approved by the regulator? Is there any requirements for that?
Yeah. So I believe on the website, we've got a list of people we're considering training from, specific groups. I can't remember them off the top of my head, unfortunately, but I'm happy to follow up with that one. But I believe there is a dot point in there that says businesses can submit their training package. So at the moment, sorry, if this is the same question I think I'm looking at, explaining the process a bit, is there a template for training available? So the closest thing we have to a template is just that course criteria, training criteria that we had on a few slides earlier, which had a QR code. If you go on the reputable Crystalline Silica webpage on SafeWork SA, you'll be able to find it there. In terms of a template, that's all that we have. We've seen businesses sort of generate their PowerPoints and just sort of provide a sort of like a checklist saying that yes, we've done this in slide so and so, and once that's sort of presented, it's very nice to have speaker notes as well, just to sort of know what's being conveyed, and just hand that up to us, and we'll be in contact if you have any questions or recommendations.
Cool, thank you, Ryan. Just conscious of time, we've just hit 11 o'clock, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then if your question didn't get answered today, please feel free to send us an email afterwards, and we're happy to answer any questions via that. Questions about air monitoring. So do small businesses conducting wet cutting bricks, pavers and tiles on domestic sites need to undertake air monitoring? The regs state that high risk is when there is a likelihood that half of the WES is likely to be exceeded. Therefore, if they conduct a risk assessment and determine it's unlikely they would exceed that WES or half the WES, would this make them compliant without doing the air monitoring?
Yeah, so part of Regulation 529 CA, in assessing whether the processing is high risk, the person must have regard to the following, and in that, any relevant air and health monitoring results previously undertaken. So this is sort of going back to what I was talking about with similar exposure groups. So if there has been a similar exposure group doing similar tasks, that's very similar to the work we've been doing, then yeah, that's fine. But you also must have regard to all of the other clauses in 529 CA. So specific processing, the form of crystalline silica, proportion of CSS concentration, the hazards associated with the work, whether it's likely to exceed half of the exposure standard, any previous incidents or illnesses or diseases associated with it. And even if air monitoring does show that, you know, it exceeds half of the workplace exposure standard, you know, people would assume that would be high risk, but you also got to consider the duration of it as well and the exposure. So if it's a task that's done once per year, but it's exceeded, it's less likely to be high risk. But of course, you got to consider all of those other clauses in 529 CA.
I think I might throw in a comment there, and if I was a PCBU managing such a subject as silica, and it's genuinely acknowledged amongst industry that this is a killer, so to speak, it does do harm to workers that are exposed to it, or anyone, general public, etc., that are exposed to it. If I was in business for myself, again, I would want to be confident that I'm managing all of this properly. I would put myself in a position for the best defence, despite what I might believe to be low risk in my own assessment processes. If I wanted to validate it beyond reasonable doubt to a worker that what they're doing is actually safe, I would conduct air monitoring. I think your results will, one way or another, will confirm an outcome, a course of direction for you to take as a PCBU, and give yourself the best defence mechanism that you actually assessed it correctly, it's low risk, your controls are working, etc., etc. Yeah, I personally couldn't recommend putting yourself in the best defensive position in relation to this particular subject and meeting compliance with regulations. That's my personal belief.
Yeah, no, well said, Stuart. Well said. Thank you for that. Okay, apologies if we didn't get to your question today. As I said before, please feel free to send us an email. My email address is there on the screen. If you do have a question that didn't get answered today, you can send it through there, and we'll make sure that that question gets answered, and we'll respond to you. Thanks for joining us today and for your participation. We really hope that you found the information useful and that you can take something away from today to ensure we are protecting ourselves and our workers from silica exposure and staying compliant. A special and big thank you to our presenters, so Stuart Robb, Ryan Jurkowski and Michael Paterson. We really appreciate all your input and for being here today. Thank you. So that is, all from us here. So again, if you want to discuss anything further or have more questions, feel free to give us a call. If it's a more technical question, please do send us an email. We're more than happy to answer any other questions outside of this forum. Just to also reiterate, we won't be sharing the slides, but this webinar has been recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube channel. And on the recording, you will be able to see all the slides on there. So slides will not be sent out, but there will be a recording of the webinar. To which email address? So just the one that's there on our screen, the screen right now. So help.safework@sa.gov.au. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next time.